This is the Grace MacInnis visiting lecture scholar, and we're always so pleased when we actually can honor someone who is so very much in the legacy of Grace MacInnis, and that, of course, I'm talking about Senator Ratna Omidvar. My name's Ellie Stebner. I hold the J.S. Woodsworth Chair here in the Department of Humanities. And of course, how many of you know who Grace MacInnis is?
I do. I do know.
Let me just say a few words about Grace MacInnis, because she was one of Canada's great women. She was the daughter of J.S. and Lucy Woodwards, the chair that I hold here. She served in both the BC provincial legislature and also as an MP in the House of Commons. I believe it was the 1968 election, and she was the only woman MP in the Parliament, which is quite shocking. She also was an advocate for women, for the rights of Japanese people, for immigrants, for the poor. She advocated for adequate housing. She actually advocated for consumer protection and all those things that are so important to us. And so it's our honor tonight to welcome the Senator. The Senator is an expert on migration, diversity, and inclusion. Her work very, very much falls into the legacy of Grace MacInnis. The Senator, of course, has received numerous awards, including the Order of Ontario and the Order of Canada. She has received a couple honorary doctorates and is also a visiting professor at Ryerson University, where she has founded and headed the Global Diversity Institute or project? Exchange. She emigrated to Canada herself in 1981. And when I read about everything that she has done through these last 3+ decades, I'm quite in awe. She seems to be relentless into her commitment, a vision of Canada, a vision of people living together, not only here in Canada, but throughout the world, recognizing our differences and recognizing our commonalities. And so we are so glad you have managed to fit us into your schedule. Welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Oh. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I have to say, when you're a senator and it's part of your weekly life to get on a plane, you think twice about an invitation that brings you, 5 hours and time zones into a completely different part of the country. But I am always so incredibly impressed when I come here. This is such a unique spot for Canada, British Columbia. This is such a beautiful city, Vancouver. And the sensibility here, even as I talk to people on the street or friends that I meet, the sensibility is different. And for those of us who live in Ottawa and breathe the thin air of the political bubble that is Ottawa, it is really important to be grounded in the perspectives of people who live in our very wide and diverse country. I want to give a few shout outs to people I know who are in the audience. I have 2 colleagues, I would say old colleagues, but that would date them in age. But what I want to say is we have worked very long and hard in the trenches, and that is my friend Sangeeta Subramaniam, who is now with IECBC at Kate Saunders Coopers, who works on career counseling with the military, as far as I know. That was 2 jobs ago. We have to clearly catch up. But I'm also really, really pleased and honored, in fact, that Senator Wu has taken the time. He's your senator, your independent senator from BC. He's taken the time, and I realize, because I live this life, how difficult it is on your non-Senate time to take time from your family obligations and to come out for yet another event. He is the leader of the independent senators group, so in a way, he's my leader, and he's an absolutely wonderful leader, and is going to take us through to on the path of Senate renewal and modernization, which is not the subject of today, but it is something that occupies me definitely and him a great deal when we're in Ottawa. So I'm really honored to be the Grace MacInnis Visiting Scholar and to give a lecture in the footsteps of women I admire like Joy Kogawa or Libby Davis. And of course, Grace MacInnis herself, who was, as was pointed out, a fearless fighter on behalf of women and equal and human rights. And I sort of think about what would she think if she were with us in this room today. And I think she would both be delighted and dismayed that it seems to be the narrative of our times. I think she would be delighted to see how far women have come. And yes, there are lots more places women can go. But when you take a look at the place of gender equity in our narrative today, I think she would be delighted. She would also, look at the progress that has been made in the world on issues like poverty, disease, life expectancy, and again, I think she would be delighted. But as she would view the discourse around the world today, the tensions, the stresses, the divisions that whirl around us, I think she would be dismayed. I'm going to use my time here to dwell a little bit about the insecurities and anxieties that surround us, because I'm a realist. I'm not a philosopher like many others you listen to. I'm a realist and a pragmatist. And I'm also an optimist, partly because my life has forced me towards unfailing optimism as the road to survival. And partly, I think because without optimism, what would we have left? So let me start with my own optimism. My optimism about this brave new world that we live in, a world that prospers and evolves with difference. But before I delve into this, I want to tell you a little bit of my own story so you can place me in your imagination. And how is it that I come to this place that I am today? So I was born in India, in Amritsar, North India, home of the famous Golden Temple. And I went to university in New Delhi and proceeded then off, this was so many years ago, gosh, I feel old, to West Germany. It was then West Germany, to continue my education there. And one day I went hiking in the Bavarian Alps, like other students do, and we went with a bunch of foreign students up the Alps for a hike. You pack your knapsack in a very Bavarian way, and you sing songs, and you go up the mountain, you come up the mountain. So I went up the mountain alone, and by the time I came down the mountain, I knew I had met my life partner. Yeah. He was from Iran. There's a gentleman here in the room who asked me about, do I speak Persian? And I said, wait for the story. So yes, I do speak Persian. So he was from Iran, and after completing our studies, we decided, as it turned out rather naively, to give Iran a try. It was not a great idea because we arrived in Tehran just before the biggest turmoil Iran had been through. This was just 2 years before the Islamic Revolution. But we were ordinary people. By then, we'd had our first child, a little baby. And as other ordinary people who find themselves accidentally in the eye of the storm, I think of the Syrian refugees, we thought at first, this revolution will pass us by. It will not touch us. But of course, you're not divorced from what happens around you. And one night, it touched us. In fact, with a ferocity, leaving us with one simple, stark choice: flight. By that time, all air routes out of Iran were shut down, bombed out, and the only choice left for us was a pretty long, cold, hard journey by bus over to Turkey. And after 2 days in the bus, it was really a horrific journey, we found ourselves in a small square room, roughly the size of this room. And that was the border between Iran and Turkey. And one side of the room was Iran, where we were standing. It had a portrait of Khomeini on it. And the other side of the room is where we desperately wanted to get to, was Turkey. And that side of the room had a portrait of Kemal Atatürk on it. founder of the Turkish Republic. And I remember it was very early in the morning, and we were very cold, we were very tired, and we were frankly really afraid, because we were telling whatever lies we had to in order to get to the other side of the room. And I remember a smell. I can almost smell it sometimes, and it was the smell of fear. It was, of course, our own fear, but it was also the fear of the very young revolutionary guards who were standing around us. But this fear was accentuated with the weapons that they carried. And I think we all know that weapons and fear are a toxic combination. We were completely focused on getting to the other side of the room. We didn't tell the guards that our papers were not quite bona fide. If they checked a little clearly, they would have found some issues. We didn't tell the guards that we had a fair amount of money rolled up in the tubes of the baby carriage. They tore apart the luggage, the books, the baby powder, the diaper bag. Thank God they didn't look in the carriage. And so we got to the other side. So this is take one on my story of optimism. We did then carry on from Turkey to Germany, and the search for a permanent home started. Our choices were slim. This was the time that the US Embassy in Tehran had just been taken over by the Revolutionary Guards, and no one thought well of Iranians. But we applied to come to Canada, and within 2 days, we were rejected. But we had friends in Canada who had friends, and this is a story I tell, because I think who you know always matters. Sometimes it matters more than what you know. We had friends who had friends who had friends. And there was a minister in Prime Minister Trudeau's cabinet, Bob Kaplan. He was the Attorney General. He had our file renewed, and hey presto, we received our permits. So this is take two on my story of optimism. It was really like winning the lottery. Now, I want to tell you something, that my story is my story, but it's not terribly special or unique. The details will differ from one person to another, but we all share similar experiences, all of those who come from one part of the world to Canada, because we all leave one life to find another. And we are all faced with the inevitable struggles of rejection. We go through reinvention. We face prejudice with persistence. And I think about immigrants having the same starring role in the same Netflix series with the same 4 episodes. Episode 1 is arrival. Episode 2 is rejection. Episode 3 is some kind of renewal. And episode 4 is redemption. And I call it redemption in a non-religious way, because there is light. And this is my take 3 on optimism. We find renewal and redemption, if not in our own lives, then definitely in the lives of our children. So today my story is being told 1 million times over. People are moving for different reasons. Some are seeking adventure, love, education, new experience, and others are driven by war, opportunity, displacement, disaster, disease. So refugees and immigrants are testing our ability or our willingness as states to accept them, producing a backlash that is finding a voice in widespread populism. And I will say to you that Canada is a special place, but we are not immune to this. We're not immune to the flow of people who want to come here. We're not immune from the challenges of acceptance, and we're definitely not immune from the allure of populism, because we are living through what Yasha Monk has called a populist moment. And I thought a little bit about, we use this terminology of populism, but what does it exactly mean? Is it a convenient name for ideology that we may not share? Is it a class construct pitching real folks against a corrupt elite? Is it frustration with globalization and global institutions that appear to weaken a country's sovereignty without improving the lives of their individual citizens? Is it based on a concern about the loss of sovereignty, identity, and traditional values? Whatever the reason, a lot of people, as journalist John Ibbotson has said, simply want to blow it all up, sink it, drain it, and be done with it. But I still didn't find the definition of populism. So I looked a little further, and I found a definition from a professor at the University of Georgia. His name is Cass Muddy. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. He said that populism is thin ideology. It is thin ideology of a pure people versus a corrupt elite. And this is in contrast to pluralism, which accepts the legitimacy of many groups and embraces complexity. So simplicity versus complexity. Another commonality in populism is that its discourse is largely negative. They're against something. Anti-globalization, anti-trade, anti-intellectual, anti-women, and of course, anti-immigrant. It's also characterized by a certain kind, I think, of bad boy politician behavior, and I won't give you the names that come to mind, but there is a certain trend and a delight almost in bad boy politicians breaking norms that we have generally accepted. And while this may vary from country to country, they are often imbued with a sense of exclusive nationalism, distrust of elites, and a desire to tighten borders and cut immigration. And I think, to borrow a famous line from Jeff Goldblum in some movie that I saw, Spider, I don't know, forget. Someone should think of this movie, I don't. He said, we should be afraid. We should be very afraid. And there are 4 reasons I can think of why. First, as I said, one of the strongest threads of today's populism is anti-immigration, and at its heart, it's based on a fear of the other, of loss of control, and loss of identity. This is where thin ideology has flourished. It has a simple message that is easy to understand, and it is us and them. It creates a politics that sees the others not simply as different, but different and therefore dangerous. And adversaries become enemies, and an enemy is someone, as Michael Ignatieff has stated, someone you feel you have to destroy. So we end up with a political discourse that is divorced from nuance. Everything is, black or white, absolute. There are no shades of gray. And some populist leaders use this to whip up fear. They keep their followers in a constant state of anger and anxiety. And those who differ are portrayed as someone less. I will never forget after Brexit, the vote that shook all of us up as the beginning of this populist movement, when Nigel Farage hailed it as a victory for the real people. 48% of citizens of the United Kingdom voted against Brexit. Are they not real people? I didn't get that. Let me now focus a bit on Canada. We're having our own sort of populist moment here. Let me talk about the surge of asylum seekers, the so-called surge of asylum seekers across the border from Quebec. And we've heard much about terminology of illegal migrants creating a crisis. And I want to be absolutely clear about this. I do not support opening our borders willy-nilly. I believe we have to exercise good governance and be true to our processes, obey our laws and the laws that we have signed on to internationally. I also believe that words such as illegal create negative connotations which will have an impact on the hearing of the individual and unnecessarily criminalizes them before a quasi-judicial court. I personally prefer the word irregular to illegal. But the fear and rhetoric seems to be working. One poll showed that a majority of Canadians believe that asylum seekers crossing our borders is a crisis. What are the crises facing our country? NAFTA is a crisis, or what happens with it. I think what happens with the pipelines will be a crisis. I think what happens on climate change will be a crisis. This is a crisis. Let me share some numbers with you. Last year, 20,593 asylum seekers crossed irregularly into Canada, more than 90% in Quebec. you add to this number another 20,000 plus asylum seekers who come through regular means. And in other words, they come from somewhere and apply at the airport. Over time, in the last few months, these numbers have stabilized. We're looking at 60 people a day crossing. Let me put that in stark comparison to you with some other jurisdictions. Germany, 1.2 million refugees. Lebanon, whose population swelled by 25%. Pakistan, which is overrun by Afghani refugees, they have a crisis. With a population of 36 million people in Canada, 60 people crossing a day, we can manage this. I am not saying we should open our doors willy-nilly, but I do say we have the capacity to manage it. I actually went to visit a shelter in Toronto over the summer to see how chaotic and terrible and what chaos and crisis that has resulted. Well, it was pretty orderly, I want to tell you. People were being looked after. They were working together. They were asylum seekers from Nigeria, from Haiti, from all parts of the world. Some were even from Pakistan and Afghanistan, I think. But they were all working together on looking after their daily needs. There were city councillors there, city staff had stepped in, their children were being organized to be taken to school, etc., etc. There was peace, order, and good governance. There was no crisis. And I asked one asylum seeker from Sudan why she and her family made their way to Canada. And she teared up and she said, "This is the first place where I feel safe and I feel respected and I feel human." So I'm going to say to you, there is no crisis. It is a challenge. Yes, we need to process these asylum claims in a manner that is both fair and fast, and people argue with me that you can't have both. You can't have fair and fast, but I think you can do faster than what we are doing, and the reason why we're not being able to process the claims fast enough is because we have not given the proper resources to the governance system. You can't have it both ways. On the one hand, you can't expect to process people quickly and fairly and have confidence in and the public should have confidence in this system. And on the other hand, rip most of the resources away from it. We are lacking judges, we are lacking staff, and maybe we need to do something in the short term until the surge subsides. But I will say it is not a crisis. Second, why we should be concerned. Populism, I believe, prevents an energetic engagement with diversity. It erects walls, whether literally or figuratively, that stand with the reality of an increasingly interconnected and independent world. An indigenous cultural commentator in Toronto said something very appropriate, and I'm going to quote this. He said, "Diversity is the natural order of things. If you resist diversity, you resist nature." So it's not diversity or extreme multiculturalism that divides us, as Maxime Bernier has proclaimed. In fact, multiculturalism is so much part of our society that we now say in Canada, it is in our DNA. It is in our institutions, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, and our civic and cultural life. And whilst I do believe that Canadians don't exactly grasp what multiculturalism is, it's a bit of an aspirational idea, but there are some facts to back me up. And I want to give you a few of these facts. 85% of immigrants eventually become citizens. This is the highest naturalization rate of any other country. Immigrants are proud of Canada. In fact, they take greater pride in Canada than the Canadian-born. The vast majority of immigrants identify more with Canada than with their country of birth. And what do Canadians think? Canadians' top choice. This is a very interesting finding from an Environics poll. Canadians were asked, what makes us unique? The top choice, the question was, what makes us unique and what is our greatest gift to the world? So I would have thought hockey. I would have maybe thought, we have aspirations of peacekeeping and international aid or even maple syrup, but no. It is this top choice. Our biggest gift to the world is this idea of multiculturalism and diversity. So I reject any ideas that multiculturalism divides Canadians. I think it is a kind of a glue that holds us together. What does divide us, and we have to be aware of these, is inequality. If left unaddressed, inequality will fuel populism. I don't think it's an accident that the most fervent supporters of populism in the States are those who were from the Rust Belt states, left behind by the various forces of globalization. And one has to listen to all the people, and not listening to those people, the Americans made a choice. And I think this has consequences. One of the consequences of inequality, and lots of people have written about this, and this is, I think, something we need to think about, especially as I took a little tour of Vancouver yesterday. You're an incredibly prosperous city. But prosperity does not necessarily mean we are inclusive. You can have prosperous societies that are exclusive. You can have socially cohesive societies that are also not inclusive. And one of the results of inequality is that people live increasingly different and separate lives. They live in different neighborhoods, they go to different schools, they shop in different stores, and they occupy less and less the common public square, whether that public square is metaphorical or literal. And what I think is lost is the sense of democracy, which is that regardless of our socioeconomic status, we have a common life, and that people from different backgrounds encounter one another in daily life. That's how we learn to negotiate and resolve our differences. I think this is true as well for our encounters with different cultures. Democracy requires that we embrace the creative disruption of new relationships, new ideas, and new perspectives. And democracy and pluralism, I believe, reinforce each other. Isolating ourselves, which is what the option being presented to us is, leads to homogeneity and groupthink. And I will quote Albert Einstein, who said, when everyone thinks alike, no one is likely thinking very much. And this is hardly the place we want to be. We need all the talent and energy we can get. Closing ourselves off from immigrants or refugees we might miss someone like Tariq Haddad. And I want to quote Tariq Haddad's story. He and his family and their chocolate business in Syria was bombed out in Damascus. They lived 3 years in a refugee camp. They arrived with the surge of privately sponsored refugees, and they went to Antigonish, Nova Scotia, and they set up the same chocolate factory, or more or less the same chocolate factory in a different place in their new home. Their company is called Peace by Chocolate, and it has such soaring demand. They've opened an even larger modern factory in Antigonish, and now they employ 20 local people who were unemployed before. Now, I'm actually telling you the story because we all need stories like this to invigorate us. But I also have another point of view that we have to not always imagine and expect every Syrian refugee or immigrant to be a hero, because that's not realistic either. We have to normalize this. We're still on why population is dangerous. That's my third reason, because it perpetuates ignorance and propagates myths. Let me give you a quick example. There is the myth that immigrants take away jobs. In fact, all the data from all over the world tells you that they take low-wage jobs most of us avoid. There is the myth that immigrants are a drain on our social programs. In fact, very few immigrants, relative to Canada's population, receive social assistance. There is the fact that we are being overrun by refugees. In fact, refugees account for only 7% of the world's population. The greatest problem right now is people who are displaced in their own countries, like Syria, like Myanmar, like Venezuela, where they have no choice and are not counted in the refugee population. And then there is the myth, that immigrants create parallel societies, they live in their little bubbles, in their little enclaves, and they often stand apart. And this is something I've engaged myself a little bit. And I go back to history. History is a very good teacher here. When the Italians and the Irish came, both before and after the Second World War, they too did what successive immigrant communities have done. They too huddled in their own communities what was familiar to them. Cabbagetown in Toronto was called Cabbagetown because of the smell of cabbage, poor Irish people cooking cabbage in their houses. The Italians carved out a niche for themselves because they came, I think, right after the Second World War, and they were told that the streets in Canada would be paved with gold. And they found out when they came here, first of all, there was no gold. Secondly, there were no streets. And thirdly, guess who was going to build the streets? The Italians were going to build the streets. So no doubt, I think immigrants in the beginning will cluster within their own communities, their own comfort zone. Today, I'll give you an example where immigrants are clustering economically in sector hubs. I think this is a very interesting phenomenon. Koreans in my city have taken over the corner store industry. All the dollar stores are run by Somalis. And the entire airport security and taxi industry is run by the Punjabis. It is their sons and daughters who are theirs and our biggest hope. And of course, one of the most hopeful signs for me is that in places like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, people are falling in love across races and ethnicities, and the intermarriage rate between races is on a constant rise. And I always say, when nothing else works, trust in love and sex. So here I couldn't ever use that in the Senate, could I, Senator? No, I don't. You're So here in Canada, we do have some special conditions that create a certain kind of, I think, a hope for us. We accept more readily that over time, immigrants are a success, both for themselves and for Canada. Immigrant children, we know, tend to do better than their Canadian-born colleagues. Immigrants buy homes at an impressive rate, and I know this may be a problem in this city of lack of affordable housing, but it is an expression of attachment to this country. And even if their entry into the labor market is at the beginning somewhat challenging, over the longer term, they seem to ameliorate these quite well. So resiliency, renewal, reinvention are common chapters. Just give you an example. I'm a teacher of German as a second language. That's what I qualified with. And when I came to Canada, I realized pretty quickly no one in their right mind would want to learn German from an Indian who had just come from Iran as a refugee. So I put that aside. But I knew, because of my education, my education qualified me to embrace other challenges, which I did. And so I reinvented myself, and here I am today. Still on populism. Why is it dangerous? Because it undermines the basic underpinnings of democracy. The populist may well use democratic means to gain power, but then they often start chipping away at the norms and institutions on which democracy is based. I live in Ontario. We're having a real live moment, so to say. And these institutions are a free press, an independent judiciary, independent institutions, etc. If we have learned anything from the Trump presidency, it is how norms that were once considered absolute can quickly become obsolete, how things that were unimaginable can soon become unexceptionable, and things that we never dared to say now get talked about, have been normalized. So 4 reasons to worry: division of the world into us and them, antipathy to diversity, perpetuation of myths, and underpinning of the norms on which democracy rests. So how should we respond? I think there are a number of things we can do, and especially Canada can do, and we're well placed to lead. In fact, I think we have a responsibility, because if we can't make it work here, I doubt we can make it work anywhere else in the world. And the truth is, when it comes to immigration, we've done a lot of things really right. I know we, as Canadians, we always like to see the glass half empty. We're not optimistic enough in this country. We've devised smart policies. We have good governance structures. We do a fairly good job over time of integrating people. And while we are far from perfect, we bring a lot to the table. I want to acknowledge the luck of our geography. That is a happy accident. We're in the cap of the world, three oceans surrounding us, a border with arguably the most prosperous country in the world. But we're also fortunate in our history. We are a young country first, with over a century and a half of holding a nation together despite all the differences and tensions. And we have largely succeeded of what's in our DNA. This is incremental negotiation, accommodation, and reconciliation. Accommodation with Quebec, which has its own French language laws. Negotiation and ongoing negotiation with provinces over authority, power, money, pipelines, what have you. Accommodation with a growing multicultural population. And reconciliation with our indigenous peoples, which is still very much a work in progress, and I will frankly submit it is our national shame. Canadians, by and large, understand that immigration is in the national interest because we're a very large country with a very small population, and is one of the many policy tools, not the only policy tool. It's one of the many policy tools we must deploy as we continue on our road to nation building. So whilst we will argue about the particularities of what kinds of immigrants do we need, how tall and short should they be, where should they come from, we actually don't argue that we need immigrants. Even Maxime Bernier has said we need immigrants, we just don't need that many of them. Let's talk a little bit about identity, because this is a pain point. People are afraid of a loss of identity. And scholars and academics often say that Canada doesn't have a single identity. I think that is right in one sense and a little wrong in another. What Canada doesn't have is a single dominant ethnic identity. It never had at the founding of our nations, and it isn't true today. Our three solitudes, starting with the French, English, and Indigenous peoples, has expanded to include so many more. And this was sort of born out of a political reality after the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, the launch of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Multiculturalism, and as arrangements for these three solitudes were being put forward, it was a Ukrainian senator from Manitoba, I think, Paul Yuchik, who said that Canada is not bicultural, but multicultural, and the solution for Quebec has to include multicultural communities, or it wasn't going to fly. And this led to the first multiculturalism policy of 1971. And the multiculturalism policy is, I will submit to you, misunderstood. I believe very firmly it's an aspirational idea. The policy in and of itself, it's weak. It has no levers attached to it. But it has two basic ideas. One is simple respect for diversity of race, ethnicity, culture, and religion. The sense that diversity is normal, it is not a problem to be solved. The other is acceptance of the idea that integration works best when it works both ways, when the host community is ready, willing, and able to integrate, and when the immigrant community is ready, willing, and ready to integrate. It takes two. Now, I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. I do not live in a multiculti la-la land. I do know that diversity creates discomfort and even chaos at the beginning. When this discomfort lasts longer and is fed by an allegiance to ethnic nationalism or a misguided idea of the past, whatever it is, it can have devastating consequences. And we've seen in other parts of the world where it has pitted communities against each other. We have not done that, and we should be proud of that. We have greater flexibility and openness for different identities, different histories, and different religions to benefit from. And we have one particular benefit that I'd like to talk about, and that is almost, I wouldn't say it's accidental, but it benefits this idea of diversity and multiculturalism, and that is our electoral arrangements. Our electoral arrangements are first past the post, make it virtually impossible for any single political party to be elected without the support of immigrant communities. There it is. Now, I know there's a lot of talk, especially in this province, about proportional representation, but I have believed in proportional representation for a long time. I've begun to become a little wary. Look what's happened in Germany, 90 plus seats for the far right. Sweden again. So I wonder about lessons from the world that we should be aware of. But we must continue to do the right thing and continue to add on that. I think in order to stay an open, pluralistic society, we must reduce inequality. I know that Canada is a prosperous nation, but we're also, as our prosperity has grown, so has inequality. And all the literature and science tells you unequal societies are less cohesive societies. Inequality between men and women, between races, inequality of opportunity. So I think of Canada, a nice metaphor is to think about Canada as a big tent, and there is heat and fire in the middle, and there's warmth there, and there are people spread all across this tent, and there are people on the edges. These are the people who don't have housing or affordable housing, who are not able to work because there is no childcare. We have to look at some big policies to move people closer to the warmth in a tent. And on housing, since we're in this city and this province where housing is such an issue, I think it's a good idea to make housing a human right, but I think it's far better to make it a reality. So the second thing we must do is ensure Canadians that they can have public confidence in our governance systems as it relates to people wanting to come into Canada. This is really important. As soon as the people have a sense that our systems are working, their fear about unfairness will dissipate. So regardless of the numbers of asylum seekers or immigrants coming into Canada, it is essential to demonstrate that our systems work in ordinary and extraordinary times. And in order to do so, we need to follow our own laws and that of our international convention. And we must demonstrate through actions that peace, order, and good governance prevail. Third, and this is I'm going to go into what might be, what I would like to see, I think Canada should take a long, hard look at itself in the policy mirror. Our immigration policies have always reflected a bias for the highly skilled. I'm not an economist, but I look at the labor market shortages in the service industry, and I know that an economy needs workers at the high end and at the low-skilled end. And because we have no such capacity to bring in low-skilled workers to meet labor market needs outside of bringing them in temporarily, which creates all kinds of different programs, I think it is time for us to consider a new immigration stream which would provide a release valve for those who may not be refugees, but who are escaping crushing poverty in their own countries and whose labor is badly needed in ours. Another really important thing we should do is we should make sure that the benefits of multiculturalism and diversity are experienced throughout our country and not just in big urban centers. We've had some very interesting experiments. I will give you Nunavut has, for the first time in its history, successfully attracted more than 400 immigrants. Now that's a small number, but it is Nunavut. Atlantic Canada has put itself together, working in cooperation with all the Atlantic provinces and the federal government to attract and retain. It's the retention that is a challenge. I think it's also important for us to consider a few new ideas. Migration has three players in it. It's the migrant himself or herself, the country that they come from, the sending country, and the country they come to, which is the receiving country. And in this sort of triangle of migrant, sending country, receiving country, there are only two winners. It is almost always the migrant over time. who will succeed and the receiving country that will enjoy the benefits of migration. The sending country loses people, usually with high human capital. And I discount personally all the evidence around remittances because I don't think remittances are, create the kind of bottom-up development and infrastructure that the countries need. So there's significant brain drain from these countries, but we could think of turning migration from a double win or a single win to a triple win by developing relationships with sending countries and anchoring our educational institutions for training human capital that can be deployed both in this country and in the sending country. And I know some people will say, if you have a college of nurses in the Philippines where they are trained to Canadian standards and then they can come to Canada without barriers and get a job, won't all the people who are trained leave? In fact, the literature says that more and more people are anxious about making that choice. I'm an immigrant and I'm a Canadian, but I think about that decision to leave home, and every now and then I think about my life, what it would have been had I stayed home. And I can get quite emotional about it because it's language, culture, music. Every time I go to India and the door of the airplane opens and India confronts me with its sensations, I am weak in my knees. After a week there, I want to leave. I can't take it anymore. But I think we must consider the fact that triple win migration will create a different paradigm. I think we need to aim for deeper diversity. Immigrants and visible minorities still face barriers. They are still shut out based on the strangeness of their names and have to submit more CVs for the same shot at job interviews. When I came to Canada in 1980, this is, 2018. I don't know how many years it's been. It's the same problem. I was told to change my name. And I was told to change my name because they said, your first name, your second name, who the hell will remember it? It's too complex, choose another name. So for a week in my family, we tried different names. I was Rita one day, I was Rosa the other day. It didn't stick. So I kept my own name. And guess what? The problem won't go away. And so this is a problem. We should also think about inclusion. I sometimes have a problem with the word diversity because diversity is a demographic indicator. It's no more than that. It's what you make with it. It's like baking a cake. You put all the diverse ingredients in your kitchen pantry. Kate will relate to this because she's a baker. You put it all together and something marvelous happens. And that's what we need to be thinking of. And because I'm a legislator now, I think about legislation, and employment equity, for example, has been an incredibly important tool, bringing important policy to bring people from the cold out into the warmth of the tent. And I think now it is time for governance equity so that we look at those people who sit on the boards of our agencies, our commissions, our not-for-profit organizations, our corporations, our public agencies, and say, how do these reflect the diversity of our country? And finally, I will say that we have to all recognize that migration is a global phenomena, and the best way, getting back to irregular migration, the best way to prevent irregular migration is to make the source countries prosperous. That's the best way. And I think using the lever of foreign aid is simply not enough. We have to make investments in infrastructure. We have to look at merging development and infrastructure. We have to look at industries and education and partner with people so that there is a steady march from poverty and oppression to opportunity and justice. And this, frankly, is the best way. Keep making those countries prosperous is the best way of keeping our borders and every other border safe. So yes, Canada has a lot of work to do, and we've done well, but we have a strong foundation. We have valuable assets, our geography, our history, the way we think, the way our institutions, such as this wonderful institution inviting me to speak about these issues. These are important conversations to have. But let me close with a plea. we must stop talking to people who think and talk like us. These are echo chambers, I imagine, which are comfortable and comforting, but they will not lead to finding some middle ground on those issues that divide us very deeply. We must find a way of talking to each other that is civil, that enables us to at least understand each other's point of view, if not reconcile our differences and fears. How we do that, I propose that is the subject for the next Grace MacInnis lecture, and I would look forward to being in the audience for that, and that is my final take on optimism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very, very much. The senator is tired,
Yes.
but we do have time for questions, and she welcomes them. Please come to the mic that's here in the middle aisle.
Thank you very much, Senator Omidvar, and welcome to Vancouver. I enjoyed your great presentation, and talking about multiculturalism and diversity, let me tell you that I am a former president of the North Shore Multicultural Society and a founding member more than 30 years ago. I have helped thousands of immigrants to settle down in here. We have come a long way in this beautiful country to get to this point. The vocabulary about diversity and immigration has changed a lot. We used to have tolerance,
yes,
then recognition, then appreciation, and then we say that we celebrate our diversity, and diversity makes us strong today. I am an advocate of multiculturalism and integration together at the same time to benefit everyone and to benefit us. What worries me here, I'm updated on global issues and Canadian issues on a daily basis. What's happening on the other side of the border is worrying me because there's a draft, there's a wind of this populism coming to, our side, actually. I'm following up on NAFTA negotiations every day and the tricks and the blusters on Canada to squeeze Canada for a better deal with someone who has been a dealer and a broker, by the way. So I'm really concerned to see if we have checks and balances against that kind of populism. Populism used to be more charismatic leadership. We had Nasser in Egypt. We had President Tito in the former Yugoslavia. That was charismatic leadership. But today is different. So someone in Canada says, you know what, this guy in the White House is doing a lot of crazy things and he's successful. He's a homogenous, he is, a tax evader and something like that. And finally, he is successful. So the rise of some people here like Maxime Bernier, like, for example, Doug Ford, and they are trying to put their foot in his footstep and to follow that, say, you know what? We're going to be like that. This guy is successful. Do we have any checks and balances, to protect Canada against that kind of populism? Thank you.
So do we have checks and balances? I believe we do have checks and balances. It is called our democracy. I am a senator, so in a sense, we are the House of Sober Second Thought, and it's actually good to talk about the work we do. If every piece of legislation gets reviewed by an unelected upper house, and we're not beholden to you, to the people, to get elected. And so this is the strength that we bring to those checks and balances. We also have our judiciary, and by and large, I think we have a situation in Ontario that we'll see where it goes. By and large, I will say our democratic systems and institutions still work. But if a charismatic populist leader is able to grab the imagination of the people and get elected, democracy is on his side too. I'm very careful about this. We may not like the people who are elected in, but they are democratically elected. And I think the checks and balances, our media is fair. a free media is part of is one check and balance, a free judiciary. So far, we have a free judiciary. We don't have these processes at the United States. I think we have to remember the USA is a very different country from ours. So I want to give you some optimism and answer the next question. Thank you.
Okay, if we have a...
Sorry, could we just please keep the comments and the questions briefer rather than longer?
Yeah, I just wanted to say if there's a dictator on the other side of the world, maybe, in Russia or in South America, we've raised a lot of fuss about him because he's only a dictator. But if we have someone who is corrupt, who is a dictator, and who is actually ignoring all the norms that has been developed in the world in democracy and in politics, then, that's just a new normal. So we have that in the United States, and then we don't raise any fuss about that.
Sir, thank you.
Well, I will just respond to you by saying that the bad by politicians that I spoke about are all democratically elected. Erdogan, Trump, if you want to put Doug Ford in there, they're all democratically elected. We're not talking about dictators here. We're talking about democratically elected people where institutions have become weakened. And we don't have that, not yet. Okay.
I think a lot of the issues that promote popularism, its superficiality is based on lack of any real deep issues like starvation and just a basic distraction and a short attention span that is prevalent these days. Although with free education online, I think that's a good opportunity for positive change. I am an advocate and a repressed engineer for two NASA scientists that have created a whole new era of transit that will allow essentially Canada to adopt immigrants that are willing to stay here because housing will be, the supply-demand will be evened out.
Oh, good.
It's kind of a paradigm shift. It's really no different than if everyone was on horseback in the 19th century and they heard about this internal combustion thing that was not very noble, like a horse. So this transit is established today in the form of active magnetic levitation in 3 trains around the world. But these 2 NASA scientists that I know have created what's called a maglev pod. And it's very cheap to build and very fast to set up, not just a route system, but actually a grid system like the buses, which are we're very expensive in cities to maintain buses and trains. So the outcome of this will allow us to not, like a car created suburbia, this will allow the millions that are coming to cities now, which is unprecedented. Apparently 30% of the populations are going towards the cities for jobs. But this will allow cities to expand to not suburbia, but what I call uburbia. Uburbia. So you'd be able to actually have people that are unemployed or suffering would actually be able to have a small farm and take their...
It's a lecture of its own.
So this is coming to a question.
Oh, sir, please keep your... Please.
The question is, what avenues can I take to get the federal government to work with developers who I will be presenting to create a facility for immigrants to be able to get reasonable housing that are built by developers and have a tax-based situation for the developers.
So I want to thank you for bringing the issue of transportation. to the table. And, we need to look at every solution, and this looks like a really, I'm not a scientist.
It's called SkyTran, SkyTrain without the I.
I think we need more of these solutions in our urban hubs. Maybe the rest of your question, you and I can have a one-on-one. We have an infrastructure bank that is accepting bids if it's a big enough. I don't think the answer would interest everybody, but Senator Wu, you and I can have a chat about it. I'm going to put the emphasis on my leader here. He can take the lead on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Senator and everyone. My name is Mohammed, and I have a question and a request. Last year, a poor, innocent 13-year-old was killed here in Vancouver. 2 years ago, the police announced that they have found a suspect and they have charged him, and they're taking him to court on Friday.
Yeah.
I was very happy, very excited to hear the news. But then, when I read more about the story, I realized that it's bigger than that. The accused happens to be a former Syrian refugee. And that have changed the entire discussion. Suddenly, my happiness, my excitement was polluted by confusion and by sadness and by shock. At the end of that day, I ended up having an anxiety attack that really affected me. But before I do so, before I did collapse, I got on my phone. I called Tarek Hadhad in Antigonish. I called Mustafa Alio in Toronto. I called Hani El-Mulaya in Regina. I called Sam Namura in Calgary. I called Danny Ramadan in Vancouver. All of us are on a conference call. Just wondering, guys, did we do something wrong as a community? I don't know, we were so confused.
Okay.
And when I called them, I told them, I don't know why I'm calling you. Just give me 1 sec, please. What we decided to do is issue this statement in English, French, Arabic, Mandarin, and Cantonese. We circulated it. We just wanted to prevent this event from being misused by any populist. Now, you shared with us your view on the rise of populism and your takes on optimism. So my question to you, why do we have to have the burden of defending our community as a minority or as an immigrant? As a former refugee, I came here 4 years ago without even speaking English. This year, I became Canadian. I was named as one of Canada's top immigrants with you by RBC, if you remember that a few months ago. And still, after posting this statement on my social media, some guy comments there very hatefully, maybe not without reading this, labeling us with so many things that you talked about tonight. Why do I have to go through this? Why do my community have to go through this? This is my question. And my request to you, and to Senator, sorry, I'm just so emotional. My request to you and to Senator Jaffer and Senator Wu, please, I'm going to give you all copies of this statement. Please circulate it. Please help prevent a disaster from happening. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I have a three-part response to this situation that you're talking about. First, I think in the first line, my heart goes out to the parents and the family and the community of this young girl. A 13-year-old girl taken from life. It is unimaginable what that family must be going through. I think we have to put that front and center. Second, whoever is guilty of this crime should face the full force of our criminal justice system. Third, I hope we are not at a place where the actions of one person can be used to crassly generalize over the rest. I will admit something to you. And I'm not a Syrian refugee, but I am Indian. And whenever something happens here in Canada where, something, there are so many things, and you sort of say, oh no, please, let this pass. Because you do identify. You do identify with them. And I would advise you to do exactly what you've done. There's no need to keep this to yourself, but to put it out publicly and to be the voice of reason. These are very emotional issues, and most of the people who will react to them are too cowardly to put their name on it. And that should give you a sign. That's a good signal, I think. They don't want to speak out in open. You are speaking out in open. Well done. We'd be happy to take that back to Ottawa with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I may have a second request, tomorrow we are having a silent vigil in front of the court just to do the best of our ability. Please join us if you can.
I will be on a flight back to Toronto.
You're all welcome.
Yes.
9 o'clock, 222 Main Street. Hope you come.
Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to say I agree completely about you talking about inequity as being a really crucial issue around immigration and refugees. And also, you said that, I need my glasses, urge people to move out of your echo chambers and,
Yes.
and embrace or at least consider issues, comments, ideas that may not be fully in line with our own. That's really important. This morning I heard you on the early edition. You were talking about the complexity of this situation and how I couldn't agree more. That is so, so important, the complexity of this situation. And I think lately we've gotten into very simplistic language that I think is not only inaccurate, I think it's dangerous. I think I'm not so sure about being afraid, being very afraid. Talking about being more optimistic, I would be curious, very, very curious to know what's going on in the heads of people who are anti-immigration or and I think also we have to be curious about what's made Canada the way it is. I mean, I think if you grow up here, you're just used to being here, you don't realize how absolutely special
Yes,
this place is.
Yes.
I mean, really think about it compared to all the other societies on this planet. And you know what I think our special social identity is, Canadian identity? I think it's our idealism. And I think that thinking of the very short history that we've had, we have gradually but constantly made progress towards making a better, constantly better society for more and more, a larger and larger proportion of the population. So, you know, thinking back, Nellie McClung and women's rights, labor standards,
rights, yes.
Child
Human rights.
Well, and we don't just stop and say, yes, that's great, we passed some legislation, we're good now. No, we arrived at this beautiful society because we question, we consider other ideas, we look at things from all different points of view, we listen to people that maybe have different ideas than us, and we come at the best solution. And so
what is your question?
well, I just was wondering what you think about being more curious. And I'm particularly a little saddened about it seems open season on Canadians or white Canadian society. And I mean, I wonder about the previous speaker and we need to have more faith in ourselves and think of who we are that's created this beautiful society. Would the majority of these people automatically think badly of an entire ethnic community? we can tell the difference between a sick individual and an entire ethnic community. We are a very progressive and diverse society,
Yeah.
right?
I agree.
And I think we've labeled large segments of the population, anyone who doesn't want to talk about immigration, as, you know, with some hateful language ourselves. You know, these are racist, right-wing Nazis or whatever. And I think we have to be curious about where this comes from.
Okay. Let me share an interesting study with you. It was done by the University of Toronto that polled by the Ratna School of Business, the Monk School of Global Affairs. 1/3 of Canadians are squarely globalists. They like globalization. They like to travel. They like to think of themselves as open-minded, and they like immigration and diversity. 1/3 of Canadians do not. They do not like it. They want less of it. They want to go back to traditional ideas of identity, whatever they may be. It is that 1/3 in the middle that can be talked to. And these are called the balancers or the conditional multiculturalists. Academics call them different things. But these are the people you have to convince. And you have to convince them on a sense of fairness, that the system is fair. And you can talk to those people. So I think there is some hope. I personally have, you know, at some point maybe I'll get to the 1/3 in the other corner. I'm more interested in speaking to the balancers and understanding what their concerns and what their issues are, and can we work together? Can we meet somewhere in the middle? But thank you for those words of, you know, idealism, hope.
Can I just urge that 30%? I mean, really, do you really think that 1/3 of Canadians are unreachable, are unreasonable?
No, of course
I
they're
think
not.
we have to be curious about them. I work with immigrants and refugees. I've been working with immigrants and refugees for about 25 years. And I voted NDP for the last 3 decades. I'm not anymore. But there are some things that we really need to openly discuss about our immigrant and
Of course.
refugee
No.
situation.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should be afraid to talk about them. I don't think we should be
Well, then please
hushed
start.
up.
You should talk about them. I personally, I'm a practical person. I'm also an incrementalist. I'm kind of, you know, on the relentless incrementalism kind of thing, to borrow a line from the Calvin Institute of Social Policy. I will speak to the people I can have a reasonable conversation with. And I have these colleagues in the Senate. I also have the other colleagues in the Senate who sometimes I don't feel I can have a reasonable conversation with them on these issues, but we do work together. So thank you for that, and keep talking. I think that is our last question. The next one will be our last question.
Sorry.
Is that all right? Because it is 7:30.
I just have a short question. I'm not.
If you two have real questions that are short.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're
I
getting
don't.
statements.
Yeah.
My question is just: Canada is a big military industry, armament industry. What do you think about it? Because a lot of our refugees and so on are coming because of the wars and so on. So, do you think multiculturalism is compatible with having an armament industry? And I just wanted to tell him that the Syrian, I'm not sure why the police had to say that this guy is a Syrian refugee. I personally think, because they never tell about other criminals.
I don't think it was the police, it was the media. I think it was the media. The media has a job, and they do what they do. In terms of our goals of multiculturalism and our sense of expansive human rights, can we reconcile them with our armaments industry? I think I'm a member of the Human Rights, I was a member of the Human Rights Committee at the Senate, and we heard about how the arms agreement with Saudi Arabia had gone wrong, with the arms being used to perpetrate human rights abuses in other parts of the world. I think we have to get a little bit more stringent, far more stringent, in ensuring that when our arms are sold, and there's a part of me that says, you know, when arms are sold, they're sold to hurt somebody. But maybe that's a subject for another day. I'm not going to pretend to answer a very complex question in this way. So,
Okay, Shu Yu, last question, but please keep it
please.
short.
I'll just keep it short. The two comments. One is when we think of in a immigration country like us, sometimes this anti-immigrants and refugee, the case you talked about, is not those people can be the immigrants themselves or new immigrants. I say that, for example, in Chinese community, I heard so much about that case because there's a Chinese girl was killed and they're talking about how to close the gate for the Syrian refugees. And the community has such a big debate. And I know it's a big population really support to close the door.
yes.
And they use this case. And so this is I want to talk about in this immigrant country. It's very important how to educate new immigrants, people from a country which didn't teach them what is democracy, what is generosity, what is equality, and all these things these people need to learn. I mean, we need to, like you said, have a conversation and break those myths. And education, not only in the university, but also those adult education, those continuing education, and talking about this. And this is I like to, to spread the word and to this Chinese community.
That was no question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Great idea.
Thank you so very much, all of you, for being here, and thank you especially, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Please travel home safely and have a good evening.